Glass in Session. I'm your host, Val. Thank you for joining me. Still south of the equator on the other side of the globe, we find ourselves on the continent of Africa, in the country of South Africa, in the vineyards of Constantia. Like many other words in the wine world, Constantia can be several things. In this case, it's a place. It's wine. It's named for a person named Constance, perhaps, and it's all rolled up into an intriguing history. And that's where we're going to begin today, with the history. The history of South African wine dates back to the mid-17th century and involves the Dutch East India Trading Company and one-each 33-year-old surgeon named Jan van Riebeeck, who landed on the Cape of Good Hope, the cape formerly known as the Cape of Storms, in 1652. He was the first governor of said cape, and you may have heard this before because we talked about this in a Method Cup Classique episode, which I linked up for you, but it's just a refresher because it's not something that might stick in your mind, especially if you're not a frequent consumer of South African wines or you don't live there. Van Riebeeck's mission, as he clearly chose to accept it, was to set up something known as a refreshment station, probably not what you and I are thinking of, but it was a station to help the Dutch East India Company service their ships whilst traveling from India, as cruising by way of Africa was much safer than the old route. In 1655, vines from France, Spain, and the Rhine region of Germany were the first to arrive at the Cape. 3 years later, in 1658, Van Riebeeck planted 1,000 vines on his own farm, which is today's Bishop's Court and Wynberg. These are suburbs of Cape Town in the Western Cape near Table Mountain. The very first wines to be made from Cape grapes were made the following year. We just happen to know the exact date, as Van Riebeeck's diary entry from 2 February 1659 said this, and I quote, "Today, praise be to God, wine was made for the first time from Cape grapes," end quote. I mean, how many wine regions can you say not only were the first wines made in said year, but on this freaking date? That's fascinating to me. It should be a holiday, but it's not. I checked. Well, according to nationaltoday.com, which I think is an American thing, it is Working Naked Day, February 2nd, but that has nothing to do with wine unless you're a wine podcaster. Haha, just kidding. Back to our lead up to this next guy, Simon van der Stel. He succeeded Van Riebeeck as governor and went on to establish Stellenbosch in 1678, 1679, depending on your sources. And this is where we get our first whiff of the Constantia name, because in 1685, Van der Stel's farm planted approximately 10,000 more vines on the Steenbergen slope, which is now called Constantiaberg, and is seated in the Constantia ward in the Constantia Valley. So where did all this Constantia chatter come from? Van der Stel's wife, reportedly named Constance, is one theory. You know what they say, find a partner that looks at you the way Simon van der Stel named suburbs for his wife, including an entire freaking valley, the oldest wine region in Southern Hemisphere. Thank you very much. Except that this is not the only theory about the name. Another account is that Van der Stel rolled up on the Cape estranged from his wife, so he came with his kids and his sister-in-law Cornelia. You know what else he brought? Mad wine and brandy-making skills, that's right. By the by, it turns out that Governor Simon van der Stel put in years of service with the Dutch East India Company, and he decided he would like some land, please and thank you. This wish was granted by Commissioner Van Goens, and somehow this dude, whose titles included former governor of Ceylon and council member of India, on the group Constantia's website, well, he was also thinking that, old Gov deserves some turf. And he had the power to tell this other high commissioner dude with way too many names that I'm not even going to go into, to grant the land wish on 13 July, 1685. It was the 763 hectares just behind Table Mountain where Simon van der Stel's passion would be called Farm Constantia. And just who was this Constance again, if not his wife? Some say it was Van Goen, the land fairy's daughter. A third account is that there was a ship named Constantia that could explain the name. Finally, there's a likely Latin word explanation, as the word embodies all that Simon van der Stel believed to his core: perseverance, steadfastness, and a bunch of other words I gathered about the feminine noun from Latin. So it's not as romantic as we thought, or maybe it is, but let's get to the wine, because that's where things do get a little bit more romantic. And oh, by the way, you know what it wasn't named after? Constantia is not named after the U.S. grape called Alexander. Why am I saying that? Well, there's a black hybrid of Vinifera labrusca cross parentage here that is also called Constantia, or Clifton's Constantia. We're not worried about who Alexander or Clifton were, as they were Yanks, but I'd be curious as to why this grape's nickname was Constantia. But anywho, back to the real Constantia, where Van der Stel retired from his governor duties in 1699, and he died in 1712, willing that not only should his farm Constantia be sold 2 years after his death, but some of his slaves were also to be freed. But yes, we're at the Groot, decline, and the wine part of this history. We're going to talk about the property, what happened over the years, at least some of the more important milestones, and then, of course, try to pull some of the wine history out of that brings us up to where we are today with these wines. Because Van der Stel's kids had since busted to move out of Cape, when he died, the farm ended up being auctioned off. Part of it was sold as Bergvliet. Another part was being sold as Klein Constantia, which means Little Constantia. Then in 1716, the part of the farm where Van der Stel's buildings were, this is what we now call Groot Constantia. It was purchased by a Swedish sailor/soldier? Swedish sailor, soldier, spy, winemaker? Anyway, one each, Olaf Berg. When Swedish sailor, soldier, winemaker Olaf Berg died in 1724, his wife Anna took over Groot Constantia as the first female owner of the property. By 1734, 10 years later, the property now had 60,000 vines and was owned by Carl Weiser, who also upped the viticulture and wine production to nearly 17,000 liters by 1751. By 1761, nearly 100 years after Van Riebeek had landed on the Cape, wines from Constantia were making their way to Europe. The property changed hands a couple more times, and then the Cloete family purchased the farm in 1778 and developed the property and businesses for the next 5 generations, including a wine cellar, more outbuildings, additions to the main house, there's a pool, and another 10,000 new vines in 1780 to include a white muscat, Frontignac, Chenin Blanc, here we call Steen now, and a red grape called Pontac, also called Tanterier, Gros Noir, or Moreau in its native France. Fun fact, I pontificated about the Pontac back in season 4 in the Tanterier episode, linked if you want to geek out on red-fleshed grapes in under 20 juicy minutes. Then the wines, back then, were described as sweet and luscious by 1788, which clues us into the styles back then. And they were favorites of the courts of Europe. I see you, Frederick the Great. Sometimes they chose these wines over the likes of Madeira, Sauternes, and other sweet star and staples of the wine world into the next century. So let's see, more changing hands, blah, 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 throughout the 1790s. Okay, here we are. A fire, a couple British occupations, plural if we count the one in 1806, but King George IV of England scooped up about 60 casks of the sweet stuff in 1827. King Louis Philippe of France also dug the stuff as he was the biggest buyer in history of wine from Groot Constantia in 1833. Apparently there was still in existence today the contract from his visit that year where he had a big tasting, kind of wandered back and forth between the farms, sample, and continued to import for years as evidenced by an 1847 letter where he asked for both red and white Constantia wine. The wines from Groot Constantia would win silver medals at the 1855 Paris exhibition. Baudelaire gives a shout out to Constantia wine in Les Fleurs de Mal in 1857 in Les Nuits, which I shall now read to you in French, or not. Bottom line, he prefers even more than opium, Constantia, the elixir of, and I quote, your mouth, where love performs its slow dance. And happy work naked day to you, Baudelaire, oui? And we can move on to the medals from here. Other medals were won by Groot Constantia wines in Vienna in 1874, Philadelphia in 1876, gold in Paris in 1878, and in 1881 it was awarded 6 medals in Melbourne, Australia. By this time, Constantia is being hailed on almost every continent, from the Americas to Australia, but the party wouldn't last as Oidium and then Phylloxera would wreak havoc in 1885. Then Groot Constantia property was again auctioned off to the government for just over £5,000 sterling. It was turned into an experimental vineyard run by an Austrian viticulturist. A fire nearly destroyed the property in 1925. I think they used the word gutted, if I'm not mistaken. And then it was restored the next year, turning the homestead into a museum. It went through several cultural and managerial changes, administrivia, and more property consolidations. And let's just get to the present day. Groot Constantia, Grand Constantia, for the last 30 years, since 1993, has been a part of a nonprofit called the Nation's Estate and conserved as a provincial heritage site. Today, Constantia maintains its status as the birthplace of South African wine. Get to the wines, Val! Okay, here we go. Historically, the sweet Constantia wines, they were both fortified, some 22% ABV, some unfortified, or naturally sweet. The fortified styles would have been for shipping abroad, which makes sense as it's more stable for travel. We've learned that in past fortified wine episodes. But there are 2 I want to focus on. The first is what is made now, Vin de Constance, made by Klein Constantia, and the second is called the Grand Constance, made by Groot Constantia. Purchased by the Juste family in 1880, I hope I got that right, I found a German pronunciation for that word. They harvested their muscat, the Frontignan, in 1986. Their mission was to follow the direction of the Clotes all those years ago, and it was described by Jill Bakoff with this lovely piece on capeinfo.com as a, and I quote, golden, almost amber-colored wine with an intense aroma, high alcohol, and a lingering sweetness, and a renaissance of the sweet and luscious and excellent wine of Constantia, end quote. The winemaking process is very heavily controlled here, according to the Vin de Constance website. From the hand-picking of the late harvest grapes, very, very ripe grapes early in the morning while it's still nice and cool, to the hand sorting. The Muscat de Frontignan grapes are macerated on the skin, sometimes for up to 2 weeks. The fermentation is going to continue in 500-liter barrels after light pressing, and this can last from 6 to 12 months. And a unique step involves something called a microbial fermentation from a yeast that is not from the Saccharomyces family, which they say helps protect against rogue wee beasties that could result in funky flavors. Next, the wine sits on its lees in wood for 3 years or more. Wood of choice is also very interesting here. They use Hungarian oak, New French oak, and French acacia. They don't rack the wine off the lees until consulting with their French winemaking partners and South African wine experts. And an interesting aspect of this wine is the bottle. It was designed to replicate something similar to the Dutch hand-blown bottles from the 18th, early 19th century. It's a very unique, curvy, and asymmetrical bottle, commissioned by Bruno Papa, an Italian glass blower, and it was trademarked with the European Commission's trademark office. It comes in 500 milliliter and magnum sizes, from what I understand, and I was actually fortunate enough to try the 2008, following an incredible lunch at Hamilton Russell Estate, where they do amazing Pinot, by the way. These are full-bodied, aromatic, sweet wines, okay? The Vin de Constance, with notes of marmalade, definitely not the Pinot. They have candied fruit spice. They're balanced out with savory nuttiness and salinity, one of my favorite finds in a sweeter wine. But of course, given the vintage, the tasting notes may be different. And I don't really do a tasting notes podcast because nobody wants to hear that. So I will move on to Grand Constance from Grut Constantia. Now, this has its own legacy story. Grand Constance, I've mentioned a couple times, is in fact the French translation of Grut Constantia, like I said. From 2 acres of vines planted in 1992 next to the manor house, Grand Constance is made from both red and white Muscat de Frontignan. So it was revised, so to speak, in 2003. Its first vintage, I believe, was 2006, and the goal was to produce something similar to the 1769 wine made from the white Muscat de Frontignan at the time. But there were early attempts in the 60s and 70s to revive the historically celebrated wine. So to create the bottle, this took another 5 years, working from a picture of an old bottle of Grand Constance found in Paris. Engineers recreated the bottle, which is produced by a South African glass company today. Grand Constance's bottle is quite different in that it has a long, skinny neck, and you can get this in a 375 ml, or what we call half bottle. But the shape and style of the bottle comes from artifacts offering us clues, which also help perfect the label design. Over the years, they discovered unopened bottles, even some shards. There was even a 1774 shipment to Delaware. Yep, some American dude walking on a beach in Lewis, Delaware, in 2004 found a shard with Constantia wine on it, W-I-N, inscribed. The bottle was from the ship called the Severn, a British supply ship which wrecked during a storm on its way to America. And think about it, before our Revolutionary War here, a ship with Constantia wine crashed or wrecked or whatever, sunk or whatever it did off the coast of Delaware, and it was on its way to bringing some of this good stuff to America. Maybe that could have stopped the war. Who knows? But today, to make this wine, the ripe grapes undergo a fermentation on the skins for about a week. After racking and pressing, they hang out in barrel for 2 years. This wine's color is going to be a little bit more amber thanks to the red muscat, and it's not fortified. From what I can tell, the alcohol is around 12 to 13%, of course, vintage dependent. And looking at the 2018 text sheet, I'm seeing 187 grams per liter residual sugar. So yes, it too is a dessert style wine with stone fruits, marmalade, honey showing up on the finish. But before I pour on some juicy end bits for you, because I know this is what you're waiting for, know that you'll see the word Constantia on other wines produced at Grut Constantia and Klein Constantia. They produce other things besides these iconic wines, everything from estate wines or light wines, both single varietals, blends, some special offerings of the house, including the wines I just discussed. Again, this is not an ad. I know when I first started studying South African wine, the word Constantia messed me up. I couldn't keep the histories or the estates straight. I couldn't sort the history. I don't know if I made that clear to you who are studying today. I hope this was able to help you a little bit. And I should point out also that there are other wineries that have the name Constantia in the brand, as they are in the Constantia Valley on the Constantia wine route, some on roads that bear the Constantia name, and they are all of their own specialties, including MCC, or Method Classique, that I mentioned, a classic method sparkler. Remember, I talked about this beginning of season 10, linked for your drooling pleasure. I actually got to visit High Constantia and sample their Clos André, and it was one of my favorites. Again, not an ad, but Certainly worth raising a glass to all things Constantia, whatever the origins. But now for the promised tantalizing end bits. If you're a literature fan and have read Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, you may recall that nothing cures a broken heart like Constantia wine, even back in 1811. But you know who else would know that? Napoleon. Yep, this freaking guy again. It turns out he was packed off to St. Helena after getting his butt kicked and most likely his heart broken at Waterloo. He was supplied with plenty of Groot Constantia's heartbreak juice. I'm looking at 30 bottles a month to be exact. Rumor has it he asked for a glass of this elixir, the Grande Constance, just before he died in 1821. And finally, Charles Dickens alluded to the Constantia wine's spirit-lifting properties and the mystery of Edwin Drood, published in 1870, his final novel. And that is my final end bit for today. Thank you so much for clicking play and for making room for me in your podcast feed. I know you have so many options for podcasts and you can only listen to so many booze pods, so I'm honored you're here with me as I try to keep the content original and as entertaining as possible. Now, you can always reach out to me via email at val@glassandsession.com or on the socials. I'm on Threads, Vino With Val, same as Instagram. It's nice. Glass and Session is on post.news@Glass and Session. I'm also now on Spoutable, Glass and Session, Mastodon at Glass and Session at epicure.social, and I'm Vino With Val on Pinterest and Facebook/Glass and Session. I still have the Wine Gallon Box Twitter account, but have really stopped using it. And remember, I am the real trademark Glass and Session. If you dig smartass content, my podcast, Smoker Doodles, is at Nebelung_smoke_show on Instagram. I check in there a lot because it's just cute, and there is Glass and Session and yes, Podcat swag in my TeePublic store, linked way at the bottom of the show notes on my website and on Smokey's Instagram account. And since I don't do sponsors, I don't do ad, or I don't do Patreon, it is a small way to support the Winecast and keep Smokey well stocked with treats as he sits here on my lap while I create this booze edutainment for you. And remember, Glass and Session is a production and registered trademark of Vino With Val, LLC. Music is Write Your Story by Joy Stock. Website is glassandsession.com.